This is the V3 London gun. It was a weapon concept unlike anything that had appeared on the battlefields of the Second World War. The projectile fired by the V3 accelerated to more than 4 times the speed of sound before leaving the muzzle, pushed forward by a series of explosive charges spaced along the length of the barrel. The V3 was designed as a long-range German revenge weapon, built to bombard the British capital from deep within occupied France. Its firing position was located in the Pas-de-Calais region, near the small town of Mimoyecques. From this location, the weapon was permanently aimed across the English Channel toward London. Had the construction been completed, the Germans intended for the gun to fire up to 600 rounds every hour, day and night, without pause. It would have been a continuous bombardment engine, capable of striking the city with relentless pressure. To achieve this impossible range, the designers pursued an experimental idea, a multi-chamber cannon unlike any artillery piece built before. The concept was bold, risky, and deeply unconventional, and decades ahead of its time in theory. But the question remains whether it could have ever functioned as promised. For this film, we rebuilt the V3 in precise detail, examining the engineering, the physics, and the reality behind a weapon that was intended to reshape the course of the war. My name is Marcus Reed, and this is Iron Blueprint. The weapon itself stretched an extraordinary 460 feet in length, longer than any artillery barrel ever constructed. That vast length created the time and space needed for the projectile to accelerate through a series of staged explosive impulses. The V3 was built around a simple idea carried to an extreme scale. By extending the length of the gun far beyond any conventional artillery piece, German engineers hoped to accelerate the projectile continuously along the barrel, using high-pressure gases. The barrel itself had no rifling. This design choice reduced manufacturing complexity and allowed the projectile to reach much higher speeds without the rotational drag created by traditional rifled guns. Because of its extraordinary length, the weapon had to be assembled in segments. The V3 was composed of long cylindrical barrel pieces joined by reinforced junction sections. The final 66 feet of the barrel were constructed without junctions, so the projectile could exit the muzzle as smoothly as possible. The remaining 32 barrel sections were stacked one after another, forming the bulk of the cannon. Each connection was secured with heavy flanges held together by 16 bolts, giving the structure both strength and rigidity across its full length. The breech mechanism was taken directly from an existing German field howitzer, the 15-centimeter SFH-18. This was one of the most widely produced heavy artillery pieces of the war, and using its breech simplified production. It included a familiar locking lever and a pull-cord firing system, making the V3's ignition process similar to conventional artillery, despite the weapon's massive scale. Along both sides of the junction sections were auxiliary chambers. These chambers held solid fuel charges designed to ignite in sequence as the projectile passed each junction. Every time the projectile reached one of these chambers, the fuel inside was triggered, injecting another burst of high-pressure gas behind the round. This system provided multiple impulses of acceleration, allowing the projectile to gain tremendous velocity along the barrel's full length. The auxiliary chambers were straightforward in construction. Each one used the same flange connection as the main barrel and consisted of a shortened barrel segment capped with a welded steel end plate. A 90-degree screw breech in the cap allowed crews to reload the solid fuel charges after each firing cycle. The entire gun was fixed at a 50-degree angle and permanently aligned toward Westminster Bridge in London. Since the weapon could not be rotated or elevated, its accuracy depended entirely on its fixed orientation and the consistency of its firing sequence. Each block of 5 barrel segments stood on its own set of steel support legs, which were anchored deep into the rock inside the tunnel complex beneath the hill at Mimoyecques. These supports had to carry immense mechanical stress during firing, and the underground installation provided the stability the weapon required. The projectile designed for the V3 London gun looked remarkably similar to a modern tank sabot round. In function and in form, it operated almost exactly like an armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot round, a design decades ahead of its time. The Germans produced several versions of the projectile, ranging from 4.3 feet long and 172 pounds, up to a heavier 10.7-foot model weighing 308 pounds. Despite the variations, all shared the same aerodynamic profile. The elongated body reduced drag, but made spin stabilization ineffective. To compensate, engineers added fins at the rear. These fins increased drag at the back of the projectile, keeping the nose pointed forward throughout its flight toward London. Detonation was triggered by a simple but very reliable mechanism. At the tip of the projectile sat a wooden plunger. When the nose struck a target, the plunger pushed inward against a striker pin that was normally held back by a strong spring. The shock of impact compressed the spring, driving the striker into an ignition fuse. This fuse lit the main detonator deep inside the projectile's body, which then triggered the high explosive charge. The largest shells carried up to 55 pounds of explosives in their central section. Because the fins at the rear prevented the projectile from fitting snugly inside the 15-centimeter barrel, the Germans needed a method to keep the round centered and prevent gas leakage during firing. Their solution was a cast-iron guiding cage mounted near the front of the projectile. This cage held 8 sleds that kept the round perfectly aligned as it traveled through the smooth bore barrel. The guiding cage was built in 2 pieces, both of which detached and fell away once the projectile exited the muzzle. At the rear of the round was a heavy piston that drove the fin-stabilized projectile up the barrel. This piston included a long sleeve that extended backward. Without this sleeve, the piston could not seal the propellant gases behind it, and the entire firing system would have failed. The piston and projectile were connected only by a small nub that sat in a shallow cup on the back of the round. In the center of the piston was a narrow channel that allowed a small amount of gas to pass forward into a chamber inside the projectile. When the round left the barrel, that trapped gas pushed the piston away, ensuring clean separation during flight. The result was a complex but elegant engineering solution. A fin-stabilized long rod penetrator accelerated by staged propellant charges along the length of the barrel, equipped with a detachable sabot at the front and a self-separating piston at the rear. For the 1,940 seconds, it was nothing short of revolutionary. To fire the V3 London gun, the crew followed a process that was entirely mechanical, yet extremely demanding. Every action depended on timing, coordination, and the flawless handling of enormous forces inside the barrel. The loading began with the projectile itself. The shell, already mounted inside its detachable sabot cage and seated on the rear piston, was inserted into the breech. After this, the crew loaded the main powder charge, followed by a standard German 15-centimeter howitzer casing taken directly from the SFH-18 field gun. This casing held the primer and provided the initial ignition source for the shot. With the round in place, the breech was closed, using the same locking lever system found on the field howitzer. The breech crew confirmed that the tunnel was clear, then switched the safety mechanism to the armed position. Inside the breech, this action rotated an internal shaft that allowed the firing pin to move freely. Once the gun was declared safe to fire, the gun captain pulled the firing cord. As the cord tightened, it forced the striker backward against a spring. When the striker reached its release point, the spring pushed it forward with force, driving it into the primer on the base of the casing. The primer detonated instantly, igniting the main propellant charge behind the piston. The pressure expanded inside the piston and forced its sides outward, creating a perfect seal against the smooth bore barrel. This tight seal prevented gas from escaping around the piston, allowing all pressure to push the projectile forward. At the same time, a small portion of the gas traveled through the channel in the center of the piston and filled the cavity inside the projectile. This trapped gas would later separate the piston from the round once it exited the barrel. As the projectile advanced, it reached the first auxiliary chamber mounted along the junction section. The extended skirt of the piston kept the fins sealed until they cleared the opening. Only when the fins passed the first chamber did the hot gases vent into it, igniting the solid fuel block stored inside. This process repeated itself up the entire length of the barrel. At each chamber, a burst of gas would ignite the next charge, adding another surge of pressure that accelerated the projectile farther. In total, 32 pairs of auxiliary charges fired sequentially, creating a staged propulsion effect that pushed the round to more than 4 times the speed of sound before it finally exited the muzzle. Once the projectile left the barrel, the front sabot pieces fell away, and the pressurized gas in the rear cavity forced the piston to drop behind, clearing the way for clean flight. Back inside the breach, a return spring automatically reset the firing mechanism, preparing the system for the next shot. Despite its mechanical simplicity, the firing process demanded flawless precision. With dozens of chambers, hundreds of moving parts, and split-second timing driven only by pressure and geometry, the V3 was one of the most ambitious artillery concepts ever attempted. Because the V3 guns could not move or adjust their aim, they required an enormous level of protection. That responsibility fell to the Mimoyecques fortress, a vast underground complex built exclusively to shelter the London gun system from Allied detection and attack. Carved into a hillside near Mimoyecques in northern France, the fortress descended more than 350 feet underground and formed a network of reinforced tunnels, galleries, and access shafts. Its most distinctive features were the 5 angled firing tunnels known as drifts. Each drift was set permanently at a 50-degree angle, aimed directly at London, and designed to hold 5 stacked V3 guns arranged one above another. To protect the openings of these drifts, engineers constructed a massive concrete slab, 18 feet thick, over the entire surface. Heavy steel plates, almost 8 inches thick, were placed on top of this slab. These plates contained narrow openings for the projectiles to pass through, forming the final muzzle exit for each gun. Together, the concrete and steel created a protective shield meant to withstand bombing, airbursts, and near misses. The overall plan envisioned 2 identical bunkers, each containing 5 gun drifts. Only one entered advanced construction before the war situation forced German engineers to scale their ambitions back. Even reduced, the complex remained one of the most elaborate underground artillery installations ever attempted. Below the surface, the main tunnels formed a multi-level grid, roughly 100 feet underground. A large subterranean railway station served as the logistical heart of the fortress. A dedicated rail line entered through a ravine on the hillside, carrying ammunition, charges, fuel blocks, tools, and construction materials deep into the facility. Parallel to the rail line, a series of 13 galleries stretched westward. These galleries originally handled mining carts during excavation, but later they were intended to serve as the main routes for moving supplies and ammunition to the gun crews. Gallery number 2, running perpendicular to the others, acted as the central corridor that connected the entire network. Personnel and equipment moved through this gallery to reach the different work areas. From the center, galleries 6 through 10 continued past Gallery 2 and connected directly to the 5 angled drifts. These access points would have been used by crews responsible for reloading the auxiliary chambers after each firing sequence. They also provided the main route for technicians performing maintenance between shots. Gallery 1 connected the central galleries and contained 4 elevators that carried ammunition and personnel to lower levels. Adjacent chambers held water tanks, generators, and repair workshops that supported the daily operation of the fortress. Although originally built for construction needs, these workshop areas were intended to remain active for maintaining the guns once fully operational. Additional living and administrative areas were planned on the opposite side of the rail tunnel, though only a few of these were completed before Allied bombing forced construction to slow. A separate foot access tunnel connected to Gallery 2 and was also lined with additional living quarters for soldiers and maintenance staff. The fortress was designed to house between 1,000 and 1,200 personnel during full operation. 7 ventilation shafts reached the surface to supply air to the complex. Shafts 3 through 6 fed fresh air into Gallery 2, while shafts 7 through 9 ventilated the railway tunnel. Shafts 1 and 2 connected down to deeper galleries more than 200 feet underground, forming the primary airflow route for clearing smoke and exhaust gases from the gun drifts after firing. At the deepest level, more than 350 feet below ground, a final gallery connected the base of the 5 drifts. This lowest chamber would have been the site where shells were loaded into the breach and where firing commands were executed. The Mimoyecques fortress was immense, intricate, and engineered to sustain continuous firing while hiding the V3 guns from enemy attack. But operating it would have been exhausting, dangerous, and physically demanding for every man inside. Operating the V3 was not just a matter of firing a gun. It was a relentless cycle of reloading, refueling, and resetting a weapon system that demanded constant human effort. After every shot, dozens of crewmen had to move into the angled drifts and begin an exhausting ritual of manual labor. The V3 design relied on 32 auxiliary propellant chambers, arranged along the length of each gun barrel. After each firing, every one of these chambers had to be reloaded by hand. This meant that as soon as the round cleared the muzzle and the smoke dispersed, teams of men climbed narrow staircases carved into the rock and entered the hot, fume-filled drift. Most of the auxiliary chambers were supplied by small hoists, running on rails installed above the gun barrels. These hoists delivered new solid fuel cylinders to each chamber location. The crew then removed the protective caps, unscrewed the hot breech covers, and carefully inspected the interior. Any remaining embers or dust had to be cleared out first. Failure to do so could cause an explosion the moment a fresh charge was inserted. Once the chamber was safe, the crew inserted the new fuel cylinder and tightened the breech cover securely. This single action had to be repeated for each of the 32 auxiliary chambers on a single gun. In a fully operational drift, containing 5 V3 barrels, that meant 320 individual reloads for each firing cycle. Meanwhile, at the lowest level of the drift, the main gun crew worked inside the breech chamber. As soon as the previous shot fired, they opened the breech, removed the spent casing, and set the firing mechanism to safe. Then they prepared the next shell, complete with its piston and primary charge, and slid it into the rear of the gun. Above them, the teams reloading the 32 auxiliary chambers moved quickly and cautiously across steep stairs and narrow platforms, carrying fuel cylinders under their arms and tools in their hands. Any mistake risked fire, injury, or catastrophic detonation inside the tunnel. Once every chamber in that drift had been reloaded and all personnel had been evacuated to safety, the gun crew received the signal that the weapon was ready. The firing station acknowledged the clearance, armed the breech, and prepared for the next firing sequence. In theory, this entire process, reloading all auxiliary chambers for 5 guns, replacing the main round, and clearing the tunnels, was expected to take 5 minutes. German planners believed that maintaining such a pace would allow the bunker to fire continuously, day and night. In reality, this requirement was almost impossible. Fumes from the previous shot lingered in the tunnels. Heat from the auxiliary chambers made reloading dangerous. Ventilation had limits. And physically reloading 320 chambers every few minutes was beyond the capability of even the most disciplined crews. Even with a more realistic 30-minute reload cycle for all 5 guns, the projected firing rate of the fortress remained enormous, potentially more than 1,200 rounds per day. But the manpower, logistics, and sheer physical strain required made it one of the most demanding artillery systems ever conceived. Keeping the V3 operational would have required an astonishing logistical effort. Every shot demanded not only a new shell, but dozens of auxiliary propellant cylinders. Running 5 of these guns in a single drift meant consuming 50 shells and more than 3,000 fuel cylinders every hour. Inside the Mimoyecques complex, movement never stopped. Pallets of shells, fuel canisters, and replacement parts would have been moved continuously from storage areas to the central lift shafts. From there, small carts running on narrow rail lines delivered supplies to the drifts, where reloading teams waited for the next cycle. Every corridor inside the bunker was part of a carefully planned supply chain. To keep this flow alive, the fortress would have needed daily resupply from the outside world. A train was expected to arrive every day, delivering food, fuel, tools, spare parts, medical supplies, and ammunition. Without this constant input, the guns could not sustain the intensity of fire envisioned by German planners. The human element was equally demanding. Maintaining continuous operation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, required hundreds of men working in strict shifts. Reloaders, ammunition handlers, transport crews, maintenance teams, and gun operators all had to function like a single machine. Fatigue, heat, smoke, and the physical strain of hauling heavy fuel cylinders up and down steep tunnels would have taken a severe toll on every crew member. All of this effort was required before a single shell left the barrel. The V3 was not just a weapon, it was an industrial operation buried underground, and the immense logistical burden that accompanied it made the entire concept dangerously fragile. Despite its ambitious design, the V3 London gun never came close to achieving the performance that German planners promised. On paper, The weapon was supposed to fire a projectile at 1,500 meters per second, a velocity fast enough to reach London from northern France. In reality, those speeds were only theoretical. Achieving them would have required far more development time, more testing, and more engineering refinements than wartime conditions allowed. Even the construction site itself became a liability. The Mimoyecques fortress sat in one of the most heavily watched regions of France, directly across the Channel from Britain. Allied reconnaissance regularly scanned the area, and in November 1943, only 2 months after major construction began, the site was bombed for the first time. The damage forced German engineers to scale back the entire project. Plans for a second bunker were immediately cancelled. Later, the initial 5-gun drifts planned for the main fortress were reduced to just 3. This cut the total number of London guns from the intended 50 to only 15. But these reductions no longer mattered. In July 1944, the Royal Air Force launched a devastating attack, using 6 tallboy earthquake bombs, each weighing 12,000 pounds. The shockwaves tore through the underground levels, collapsing chambers and breaking structural supports deep inside the hill. Much of the lower complex became unsafe or unusable. Despite these losses, a single shortened V3-type gun was completed elsewhere. It was installed near Lamperden, Germany, and fired in late December 1944. The projectile weighed 207 pounds and carried only 20 pounds of explosives. The results were disappointing. The shell penetrated well, but its small charge did almost no damage to the unarmored buildings it struck. The guns ceased firing on the 11th of January 1945 as Allied forces closed in. After that, the concept vanished from the battlefield. The multi-chambered supergun had failed to deliver on its promise. When Allied forces finally captured the Mimoyecques site in September 1944, the underground fortress was empty. The Germans had abandoned it as the front collapsed, and the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division took control without learning what the installation had truly been designed for. In fact, no one in Allied high command yet understood the scale or purpose of the V3 project. Like other suspected V-weapon facilities across northern France, the site had already been bombed repeatedly, but its exact function remained unknown until 1945. Only after engineers inspected the ruins did the Allies realize they had uncovered the remains of Germany's long-range supergun program. Once the truth became clear, Winston Churchill issued a direct order. The bunker, he argued, must be destroyed completely. Even though the project had been halted and the site damaged by tallboy strikes, the fortress still retained enough structural integrity to be rebuilt and used again if Europe ever faced another war. On Churchill's command, Royal Engineers filled the underground complex with 10 tons of 500-pound aircraft bombs, along with large quantities of captured German explosives. Much of this material was placed directly around the entrances to the drifts, concentrating the blast on the most critical points of the structure. The resulting explosions caused major damage to the concrete slab above the gun tunnels, but most of the deeper chambers still survived. Because the destruction was not considered sufficient, a second demolition operation was planned. This time, engineers used 25 tons of explosives and focused entirely on collapsing the main access routes into the fortress. The blast sealed the entrances, choked the ventilation shafts, and cut off the interior from the outside world. By the end of the second detonation, the Mimoyecques fortress was effectively entombed. The British High Command finally considered the installation neutralized, preventing any possibility of the V3 project ever being revived. The V3 London gun was one of the most ambitious and unconventional weapons Germany attempted to build during the Second World War. Although it never reached operational status in France and never fired a single shell at London, its scale, engineering, and intended purpose made it one of the most extraordinary artillery projects in military history. Winston Churchill himself described the V3 concept as potentially the most devastating attack of all. Had the weapon functioned as planned, London would have been subjected to relentless bombardment day and night. Daily life, vital manufacturing, and military logistics could have been crippled. And if the weapon had been operational alongside a major air assault, it might have altered the balance on the Western Front, at least temporarily. But the V3 was never completed. The technical hurdles were enormous. The promised muzzle velocity of 1,500 meters per second remained theoretical, and Allied air power repeatedly disrupted construction. In reality, the sheer manpower, logistics, and maintenance needed to operate even a single V3 battery would have been overwhelming. Yet the legacy of the project did not disappear with its collapse. The multi-chamber cannon itself never returned to military use, but some of its innovations did survive. The most influential was the fin-stabilized, discarding sabot concept used in the V3S ammunition. Whether directly or indirectly, this idea helped shape modern armor-piercing rounds. Today, APFSDS projectiles, based on the same principles, serve as the primary anti-armor ammunition for almost every main battle tank in service around the world. The Mimoyecques fortress was eventually sealed, but the site was not forgotten. The project stands as a reminder of how far wartime engineering can push the limits of imagination, as well as how quickly technological ambition can outpace practical usefulness. Today, the Mimoyecques site lives on not as a weapon, but as a museum that preserves the story of one of the most ambitious artillery projects ever attempted. One of the original tunnel entrances was reopened in 1969 by a local farmer named Marie-Madeleine Vasseur, who with the help of friends and family created the first small museum on the site. Over time, this effort grew into a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving the history of the V3 and the people connected to it. The modern museum gives visitors access to the underground railway tunnel and several galleries, including galleries 9, 10, and 2. From these passageways, visitors can look directly into the angled gun drifts, the enormous shafts carved into the hillside where the V3 barrels were intended to be installed. During our visit, the museum staff provided invaluable help and generously allowed us to film inside the facility. Within the galleries, monuments now stand to honor both the forced laborers who died during construction and the Allied air crews who lost their lives attacking the site. These memorials serve as a sober reminder of the human cost behind the engineering. The Mimoyecques Museum is open to visitors during the summer months, offering a rare opportunity to walk inside one of the most unusual underground fortresses of the Second World War. For anyone interested in military engineering, artillery design, or the history of the V weapons, it is a place we highly recommend visiting.